Now, the trainees face their final test, a bomb run on an authentic World War II heavy bomber.
Go!
The recruits have been drilled in emergency ditching and discovered how essential teamwork is for a bomber crew. 22-year-old chef Luke and Kiwi Tanya completed their advanced gunnery training and experienced the shock of being attacked by an enemy fighter. After being tested and graded, Chief Instructor Brendan O'Brien announced their final crew positions.
Tanya, for you, we've selected you as our wireless operator. Luke, you, for your shooting abilities, your hand and eye coordination, you will be the tail gunner. John, you will carry on, of course, to be our master bomb aimer.
Airline pilot James and Army helicopter pilot Tim have been put through their paces on a series of authentic World War II training aircraft. They learnt aerobatics on the powerful single-engine Harvard and got to grips with twin-engine flying on the Beech 18. Then they got their first taste of a real heavy bomber, the American B-17 Flying Fortress. This week, one of them will not only skipper the crew, but will also fly another bombing legend, the Lancaster.
Our choice to go on and command the B-17 for his final bombing mission, and also to fly the mighty Avro Lancaster, is Tim. Well done, Tim. Congratulations. James, you will go on to be our master navigator. That is the crew. This is the mission. You will fly into the target area from the northeast at 500 feet at an indicated airspeed of 120 knots, and you will be dropping groups of 10-kilogram bombs. The main target area here, in fact, is a fully reconstructed German town, and your pinpoint target just here is a munitions factory.
For their final operation, they will be flying the Sally B, the only fully functioning heavy bomber in Britain, complete with gun turrets, electronics, and bomb bay doors. The trainees examine aerial reconnaissance photos to help them identify features that will direct them to their target.
It's the town here.
Their objective is a simulated munitions factory in a fully reconstructed town. It's used today by the Army for military training. But before the final operation, bomb aimer John Nolan has a surprise in store. He has found flying badges that their grandfathers would have worn during the war.
I thought it'd be nice if, for the final mission, we had the correct insignia on our flying suits. What's up?
Oh, wicked.
There we go. Air gunner.
Cheers, John boy.
There you go.
I'll shake your leg.
No
Cheers, mate.
Bomb aimer. It's me. Nav, well done, mate.
Yes, John.
Well done. I know you do a good job. And skipper, finally. Congratulations. Wear them with pride.
I will do. Thank you very much.
All right, well done, everyone. It's going to be a pleasure working with you guys. I know we're going to get it right as well.
Definitely.
But before they get into their aircraft and set out on their final operation, Brendan O'Brien will teach them how to get out of it.
We now come to a vitally important part of your training, evacuation drill. There are all sorts of reasons for going down and having to get out. You could be shot up by fighters, hit by flak, you could just plain old run out of fuel, you could crash on takeoff, you could crash on landing, whatever the reason. When you had to get out, you had to do it quickly, you had to do it efficiently, and you had to do it as a team. Locate your chute, put it on, and be prepared to hit the silk.
The fuselage has been filled with smoke, and the crew need to find their parachutes before bailing out. To make things more difficult, bomb aimer John Nolan has to simulate an injured arm.
Can somebody strap this round me, please?
In the smoke and confusion, they take over a minute to evacuate, and this plane hasn't even left the ground.
One of the chutes we couldn't actually really find is eventually I sort of accidentally stumbled across it, and in reality I wouldn't have probably found that, so one person would have been jumping out without a chute.
This is precisely what happened to Luke's grandfather on the 23rd of March 1944. His Lancaster was attacked by a German night fighter and was rapidly engulfed in flames and spinning out of control. Rear gunner Nicholas Alcomade prepared to bail out. only to discover that he couldn't get to his parachute. Facing certain death, he threw himself out and fell 20,000 feet without a parachute. He landed in a snowdrift and walked away completely unharmed. His remarkable escape would become one of the most celebrated stories of the war. Now, 60 years after they last flew operations over Germany, 4 veterans of Bomber Command have come to visit one of the last surviving Lancasters left in the world today. Bill Burke was a navigator in the elite Pathfinders, who volunteered for 2 tours of duty. He flew on Mosquitoes and Lancasters.
You've got no idea how emotional that is. Seeing that brings back memories of a host of experiences, some of which were exhilarating beyond belief, and some really plumbed the depths of sadness and fear. You've got no idea. That's where we change from naive youth to battle-hardened manhood in those.
The trainees have the chance to meet some of the men who flew alongside their grandfathers. When they were flying operations, these veterans were the same age as the 5 trainees. Just like Luke and Tanya's grandfathers, Jack Evely volunteered as a gunner in a Lancaster.
How does it feel to see the tail gun?
Oh, it's great in some ways.
Yeah.
Actually, once you were inside and the doors were shut, it was fairly comfortable. Well, it was for somebody of 21 years old.
Were you ever frightened?
Well, everybody's frightened.
Right.
Good God, yes, everybody's frightened. There's a difference between frightened and being panicky. I don't think I was ever panicky.
John Nolan hears firsthand what life as a bomb aimer was really like. Tom Wingham's Halifax was shot down by a night fighter. He evaded capture and with help from the resistance returned to England and flew a further 4 operations, including the last raid of the war.
I think the main thing you were concerned with was for the aircraft to go a bit faster than what it was. It seemed to be interminably long once you started your bombing run. You were saying, for God's sake, get me out of this, but other than that, you couldn't do anything else and just sort of stick there to see the thing through.
After shooting down a German night fighter and losing an engine, Lancaster pilot Steve Stevens managed to bring his crew home safely. He makes sure that Tim knows what being a skipper really means.
Once you're in a Lancaster, you're no longer a pilot, you're a captain, so you have all the crew to look after. So you are responsible for them. When we were 19 or 20, we were very grown up. At 19, I was always flying aeroplanes in America. And between 18 and 19, I had my own house bombed, my parents had been buried, an experience, of course, that you can't possibly duplicate.
I flew these operationally when I was 20, and I didn't expect to see my 21st birthday party. The statistical likelihood was that I would be killed before I came of age. In fact, I expected to die in one of these. I remember going into Bremen. In came a fighter to attack us, and I thought I was going to die. I couldn't see that anything could save me. And we ran into cloud. And the night fighter couldn't see us any longer. Just shows how luck played a major part in whether you lived or died.
As the Lancaster taxis up the runway, it's a poignant moment for both trainees and veterans.
Everybody thinks, well, the aeroplane was shot down as a nice clean death. That wasn't the way people died. They had a tendency to burn. And that's a terrible way to die.
This Lancaster isn't airworthy, but there is one that is. It's in Canada, and is one of only 2 left in the world that still flies today. For Tim, the crowning moment of his training will be to follow his grandfather's footsteps into the cockpit of this legendary British bomber and fly it for himself. 22-year-old Tim Chambers has been selected as the most outstanding pilot. Now, he has travelled to Canada for the chance to take the controls of one of the most famous bombers ever built, the Lancaster. It's an opportunity to discover for himself just why those who flew Lancasters thought so highly of them.
60 years ago, my grandfather would be about the same age as me, and he'd been going out to fly bombers over Germany, and it means such a great deal to me to be able to do this, fly a World War II bomber and experience what he experienced. I really cannot explain how much excitement I'm feeling at the moment.
Nowadays you'd say she was very old-fashioned, but at the time, remember, she was practically state-of-the-art.
If you imagine taking off, you're rolling down the runway and you open up 4 throttles, and everything you touch, metal, is vibrating so violently that it feels like it's hot, and that's how it was. The power that surged through the machine was terrific, and you're going to Germany with it.
Zulu Charlie Echo, Victor Romeo Alpha, let's go to the street. Roger, Zulu Charlie Echo. Just follow me through on the controls for now. Okay, I'll follow you through. You'll find Tim it needs a whole pile of rudder and very, very definite movements with the aileron. So I need to lead with the rudder first. Go ahead. As if you can feel every movement in the aircraft, B-17 felt so slow. So a bit more like a sports car.
The Lancaster's a beautiful aeroplane. I set out to find my way into a Lancaster. It's the only thing I've set out for in my life to do, and I did it.
Tim is now closer than ever to appreciating the achievements of his grandfather and all those who flew alongside him.
I can't believe 60 years ago people of my age flying over Germany and having to get control of it. It's fantastic seeing being out there. I'm enjoying it, but I'm sure my grandfather wasn't enjoying it so much 60 years ago. So what do you think so far? I can't believe I'm up the front of a Lancaster. And having these 1,000 horsepower Merlins out on my side is pretty amazing as well.
On the sound of the engines, I thought that I was the only one that experienced this, but afterwards I found a couple of my mates exactly the same. They could sit back in the turret on the way, and if the engines were running sweetly, they could imagine a full symphony orchestra playing.
The Lang needs plenty of rudder.
But Tim's piloting duties are not over yet. He still has to return to Duxford to skipper his whole crew on a bomb run.
When we get the chance to do the bombing mission, replicating my grandfather's runs in onto the target, that's just going to be unbelievable. The sort of feeling of making sure the aircraft's straight and level, you're not climbing or descending, keeping the airspeed constant so the bombardier can get a good run in on the target so the bombs go where you want them to go. That's just going to be absolutely incredible.
Tim has a tough act to follow. His grandfather was an exceptional pilot. Ivor Chambers flew over 60 operations, including a tour of duty with the elite Pathfinder Squadron. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar. For men like him, there would be no let-up in their relentless bombing campaign. Not even after June 6, 1944, when the greatest invasion force ever assembled streamed across the Channel. 185,000 Allied troops poured off the boats and landed on the heavily defended beaches of Normandy. With a foothold in Europe now secured, the bomber crews could be forgiven for thinking that maybe now there would be a respite.
As soon as D-Day came, I thought my job was finished. I'd let the rest of the guys get on with it. They've landed in Europe. It's up to the army now. That was my feeling.
It is, however, ironic that just as it appeared
to be certain that the Germans were going to be defeated on land, i.e. the time when, in retrospect, it looks as if one could have eased off the pressure from the air. That was the time at which this weapon became most powerful and most effective. It had just got very good at doing what it did, and what it did was to destroy cities.
Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, remained more convinced than ever that bombing alone would defeat Germany.
The dream that everybody had had in early years of the war had now become reality, that Harris could deliver, if not the absolute knockout blow, he could certainly make Germany crumble.
Whilst the land forces ground forward mile by mile on both the eastern and western fronts, Germany's resistance showed no signs of weakening.
There is something of a view that after the Battle of Normandy and the destruction of the German forces in France in August 1944, that was more or less it. It wasn't. Of the 700,000 or so casualties suffered by the British and American armies in Europe, 2/3 of them were incurred after the end of the Battle of Normandy.
The closer Germany came to defeat, the fiercer the fighting and the greater the casualties. No wonder that for Harris, the bombing war was far from over.
Were they seriously to say that these bombers should stay on their airfields and do nothing? There were the land forces advancing. In what way could they be helped? In what way could this war be shortened by even a week or a month?
So Bomber Command's offensive was cranked up yet another gear. In the last 3 months of 1944, more bombs were dropped on Germany than in the entire first 2.5 years of the war. But Arthur Harris's continued targeting of cities had still not provided the decisive blow. And not all the Allies agreed with Harris's insistence on targeting cities. The Americans thought that bombers were better used attacking key industries, in particular oil refineries.
The notion was that if these hydrogenation plants, which produced artificial oil from coal, could be knocked out, then basically you could bring the German war effort to a halt.
And they also believed that their scientific approach to singling out the vulnerable targets in the German economy was going to be far more effective than the British approach of bombing cities.
This difference, of course, was encapsulated in the American decision to bomb by day, so they could see these targets properly or more effectively, and the British decision that they would bomb by night.
Germany now suffered round-the-clock bombing, but the Americans were to discover just how imprecise precision bombing really was.
The problems the Americans found, of course, was that it was one thing to say you can hit these precise targets, quite a different thing to do it. It was so cloudy much of the time, and so they developed systems of blind bombing where you just attack where you thought the target was through cloud.
The reality was that for all the talk about precision, the American raiders themselves were rarely very precise. It has been said with some truth that the main difference was that the RAF precision-bombed area targets and the US Air Force area-bombed precision targets.
So for the wretched Germans underneath, there was no meaningful distinction between what the Americans were doing and what the British were doing.
The bombing continued to intensify. For Arthur Harris, there was no doubt that Germany must be stopped, whatever the cost.
Harris was now an obsessive, in that any man who personally collects in his home photographs of wrecked German cities, his famous blue books or notorious blue books, and shows them to any visitor, to the point that members of the royal family who came by would be frequently embarrassed. They'd be seized by Harris, like the ancient mariner, and dragged off to come and look at these blue books. He became fixated with these images of the destroyed cities of Germany.
Critics, especially in later years, argued that bombing cities caused terrible casualties, but made little impact on actually winning the war. But for as long as Germany refused to surrender, Harris would continue to bomb.
It was clear that Germany was going to lose the war. It was clear to everybody in August 1944, but the question was, what is it going to cost to finally slay this monster that we keep on stabbing and stabbing, and which keeps on coming back, coming back, coming back. The sheer resilience and fighting power of the German army was quite staggering to everybody at the time.
So the eyes of Bomber Command turned to new targets deep in eastern Germany. This decision would spark one of the most destructive and controversial raids of the war. By 1945, Bomber Command had become the most potent destructive force in the war. Its crews knew this, but were shielded from the worst of the horrors unleashed below.
You realised with satisfaction that you were helping to win the war that particular time, destroying their industries and their railways and so forth. The personal thought of killing people didn't enter your head an awful lot.
We had an idea that what we were doing to the German cities was what they had done to us. Our main feeling was one of self-preservation. Let's hope to heaven we get through this and get back.
It was an impersonal war. I was only too glad I wasn't in the army and had to put a bayonet through another man's stomach or something like that.
When I was in that aircraft, I was a young man. Those sparkling lights on the black velvet background, they weren't people to me. There were no people. They were just a target. It's distance and blindness which enable you to do these things. If we could have seen the women and the children burning to death in agony, I don't think we could have done it.
But as Allied troops advanced, they still faced bitter German resistance. So for Air Marshal Arthur Harris, it was now the time to hit more targets, not fewer, and hit them harder than ever before.
They were therefore looking for targets which they could destroy, ones which had not really been attacked before, and they found 3 in particular in East Germany, at the behest largely of Churchill, and they came up with Leipzig, Chemnitz and Dresden.
At dusk, on the 13th of February 1945, hundreds of heavily laden bombers set off for Germany, just as they had done on so many nights before. Their target was Germany's 7th largest city, Dresden. Their objective, to stop German reinforcements from reaching the Russian front by smashing Dresden's transport infrastructure.
Dresden was another raid just like any other. To the people who were doing it, who've been doing things like this every night for the last 4 years, it didn't seem that special. It was just another city in the last months of a very long war.
Dresden, as far as we were concerned on the day, it was just another operation. At the briefing, they said this is a very important rail and road and waterway junction, and this town needs to be obliterated.
The target seemed no different from any other, except for one thing. Dresden had so far escaped all serious damage from bombing. It didn't look like a wartime industrial target. The so-called Florence of the North was a renowned cultural gem, packed with treasures and priceless artworks. But the stunning architecture concealed state-of-the-art factories that produced radar and signal devices and communication equipment, Dresden's specialities.
Most people didn't know there were these factories in Dresden. They're not immediately evident when you go to a place like that, when what you see is the palaces and the churches on the river and the beautiful river meadows and the surrounding countryside and so on.
Worst of all for Dresden was a terrible combination of factors that would make this raid one of the most destructive of the war.
Dresden was in a sense the raid that went horribly right. It was the perfect raid. There were almost no cock-ups, which was practically unheard of. The weather was perfect, which in February is unheard of. And in fact, it was a patch of fine weather just over Dresden. 30, 40 miles to the north, you couldn't see anything.
Much of the flak defending the city had been moved to the Russian front. The air raid shelters were makeshift and inadequate. At 10 p.m, the first of the Pathfinders swooped down and dropped their blazing coloured flares. Experienced and highly trained, their job was to mark exactly where to bomb. They carried out their task with deadly accuracy. Then came the first wave of big heavies, Lancasters, loaded with bombs and incendiaries. After a deliberate pause to let the fires take hold of the city, came the second wave.
On the run into the target, it's very rare that we had any remarks from the front other than the bomb aimer giving instructions and so on. But on this occasion I do remember somebody saying, "Look at those fires, what a target." Now we must have been about 20,000 feet, and the Lancasters around us, all going in on the same heading, were quite clearly lit up with a red glow from the fires 20,000 feet below.
The second blow arrived about 1 in the morning, when people were still staying in their cellars as they were told to by the air raid authorities. They said, you know, the air raid shelter is the safest place to be.
The second wave was double the size of the first. 555 bombers poured their bomb load down onto the burning target. The fires that raged through the city were rapidly sucked in by a vacuum to form one giant firestorm.
When the firestorm came, people died in their thousands, not from being blown apart or burned, but through suffocation, through asphyxiation. The firestorm sucked all the air out. There was no escape. You couldn't get through the burning streets, so people stayed in their cellars. And that's how they died, of simple lack of air. When the cellars were broken into after they'd cooled down after the raid, in many cases, row upon row were found sitting there slightly pink-faced through the carbon monoxide, but otherwise sitting in neat rows on benches, waiting for the raid to end, which of course it never did for them.
The following day, the Americans came to finish off what the British had started. Their B-17s dropped a final barrage of bombs on an already devastated, smoking city. In less than 24 hours, between 25,000 and 40,000 people died. As many as half of them through asphyxiation. 14 miles of city lay in rubble. The scale of the damage and loss of life inflicted at Dresden ensured it would become infamous. The technology of aerial bombardment had reached its inevitable and brutal conclusion.
The distance travelled by Bomber Command, technically and in terms of capability, but also morally, was huge.
It's very hard to get one's mind around the transformation of the bomber war from those early primitive days when these very early primitive aircraft were setting out to grope, as they used to say themselves, over Germany, to just look for something to drop a few bombs on.
To the selection of Dresden as target for tonight, and the complete destruction of a city as a matter of routine.
The sophistication and the scale of those massive efforts in the last days of the war is quite extraordinary by comparison with what preceded it.
And it didn't stop with Dresden. In the following month, more bombs were dropped than in any previous month of the war. And other German cities suffered casualties that were proportionately even higher. But it was Dresden that would come to haunt the public imagination.
Dresden has just become the symbol, really, of something which was happening to a lot of German cities at that late stage of the war.
With the collapse of Germany imminent, unease started to grow about bombing in general, and Dresden in particular. Even Churchill, who had sanctioned carpet bombing from the start, began to distance himself from Bomber Command and its unapologetic leader, Arthur Harris. But it was not the politicians who would bear the burden of the guilt of bombing. It was the airmen, the young men who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs of the war, who had obeyed orders and had witnessed almost 56,000 of their comrades die in the process. It was they who were forced to swallow one final bitter pill. all of Britain's fighting men received the campaign medal, except for the men of Bomber Command.
There has always been intense bitterness among the aircrew of Bomber Command that they felt they never received the recognition they deserved. A special medal was struck for the pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain, which cost the lives of about 260 RAF pilots. By contrast, no special medal was struck for the aircrew of Bomber Command, of whom 56,000 died in the course of the war.
Nobody lost personnel at the speed that we lost them in Bomber Command. And what recognition did we get? People wanted to disassociate themselves from what we'd done. But what we had done was immense. But it was a hell of a price to pay.
I think Bomber Command should have had a medal. Fighter Command had one for the Battle of Britain. And I think we should have had one for the Battle of Germany. Definitely. Not that I'm into medals, but it's one of those things.
Bomber Command's legacy has remained clouded by controversy, but to this day, nothing will diminish the feeling of personal loss that the airmen suffered.
It was a feeling you never really got used to. It gave you a very, thinking of the people and friends of yours who may be in those aircraft. You see empty beds, and then you see them coming along and take the stuff away, and that's it. Those people are gone.
For over 4 years, the bombers had provided the only way to take the battle to Germany, and had had a huge impact on the Nazis' ability to wage war.
I don't have any regrets at what Bomber Command did. We were at war. We were fighting a very evil force. Without being melodramatic about it, we were fighting an evil force, and we were doing our bit and doing what we were told to do.
Their job was one of the most dangerous in the war, and the crews knew only too well how fortunate they were to survive. 5 men who did survive the war were Fred Logan, Harry Smith, Nicholas Alcomade, Stephen Nolan, and Ivor Chambers. Now, their grandchildren have the opportunity to fly together as a crew themselves for their final operation. Five grandchildren of Bomber Command veterans have been undergoing training as a World War II crew. They have experienced the hazards of navigating in poor weather, dealing with engine loss, got to grips with gunnery, and grappled with the complex art of bomb aiming. But more than that, each has come closer than ever before to understanding the reality of their grandfather's experiences.
I didn't think it would affect me quite as much as it has, but...
Now, the grandchildren have completed their training and will form a fully operational bomber crew. This was a defining moment of any airman's career that meant that they would be going to war. But first, there was one last piece of business, choosing the men who they would fly with, a process that was remarkably haphazard.
They took probably 100 pilots with 100 navigators and 100 bomb aimers, etc., etc., and invited us all into a very large hall. And I can remember the instructions were, well, now get yourselves sorted out.
And he said, right, you're going in there as individuals, but you're coming out as a crew.
You're all sort of milling around, and you see somebody maybe you say hello, take a liking to, and you talk to them.
You've got pilots wandering around, they've got a bomb aimer and a navigator. Are you a gunner? And yes, okay, what do you want to come on, join me? And it was as vague as that.
We said, do you want a couple of gunners? So he looked. He said, I'm a rotten pilot. So he said, we're not as good as gunners anyway. So he said, oh, well, we don't want to spoil anybody else's crew, so you're in.
It's always amazed me how it worked. But we came out as a crew to fly heavy bombers.
Now, the crew have reached this moment themselves and are about to fly their first operation. Like their grandfathers before them, they face the challenge of coming together and working as a team. Their mission is to precision bomb a target in daylight. Their aircraft is the B-17 Flying Fortress. Bomb aimer John Nolan has the responsibility of getting the bombs on target, using the Norden bomb sight, touted as the most sophisticated bomb sight of the war. Wireless operator Tanya Marriott will be in contact with base. Tail gunner Luke Alchemade won't be facing any enemy fighters, but will be an extra pair of eyes for navigator James Smith, who must make sure that he guides the crew to the target on time. And Tim Chambers has to pilot the B-17 Flying Fortress and skipper the crew.
Wire ups checking in.
Okay, bomb aimer checking in. Tail gunner checking in.
Okay, call me on heading 055.
055.
Now call out anything that you want me to spot for. Will do.
During the war, to avoid German flak, close formations of B-17s bombed at around 15,000 feet. This crew will swoop down to bomb at just 500 feet. Their target is a simulated munitions factory in a fully reconstructed town. Today, it's used for military training by the Army.
B-17, B-17.
Chief Instructor Brendan O'Brien will monitor their accuracy from the church tower. In the war, no crew flew direct to the target, so the recruits will need all their cross-country navigational skills.
Okay, bomb aimer, first point we're looking for is where the motorway crosses with another main road. Yeah, we're passing about a mile to the south of that junction. That's fine, that's just spot on. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, nose overhead. Okay, turn now, heading 030.
For their bomb run, they need to identify the exact approach to the target.
Okay, yes, visually the airfield, we're passing a beam the end of the runway now.
That's the one. There, we got it, yeah. Okay, that's our run-in point, Skip.
To bomb accurately, the crew need to make sure that they are at the right height and speed, and take account of the wind.
And we need the speed back at 110 knots. Okay, I'll do my best, guys. Yep, must have that speed and altitude right, Skipper, otherwise the bomb calculations are all off. Okay, I'm visual with the target. Left, Skipper.
On the final run-in, it's impossible for pilot Tim to see the aiming point, so he relies entirely on the instructions of bomb aimer John Nolan to direct the aircraft onto the target.
Left, Skipper.
Pilot Tim needs to hold the bomber straight and level to give them a chance of hitting the target.
Okay, guys, just be advised, we're a bit fast. Steady.
They are flying in far faster than planned,
Steady.
but John is determined not to abort the run.
Okay, we're still fast. Steady. Okay, don't worry about that, just hold us steady. Right. Steady. Bomb's gone.
Okay, I don't know what happened there, guys. Maybe you were just waiting for Christmas, but that was very, very late. You were about 150 to 200 meters over the target.
Guys, we probably overshot slightly because I was a bit fast. I was doing 140 miles an hour. I'll try and slow down this time.
The success of an operation depends on the entire crew working together as one.
You felt we could trust each other. We spent all our time together. It was like you were like a family.
It was a crew. It was virtually almost as if you were one person. You could be a dustman or a duke. Doesn't make any difference.
You welded your life round that particular bunch of blokes. If one had a date, you wanted to share the date. I remember taking a girl up and the whole crew came with me for pictures.
I had a closer affinity to my crew than to my own family, really. You would help each other. I mean, you know, you get the odd brawl in a pub or something, but the crew would always stand back to back.
During the war, no crew would have wanted to repeat what was the most dangerous part of an operation, flying straight and level over a target. but the trainees have the luxury of coming round for a second run. This time Tim must ensure that he gets the speed and approach exactly right.
Keep her on this heading, skipper.
Okay.
Steady. Steady.
Okay, we're a bit slow and a bit low, guys. Just...
You sort that out.
Okay.
Just keep her on this heading.
Okay, bang on height, on speed. Okay, guys.
Okay, left. Steady. 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 Bomb gone!
The line, you're slightly to the right of the target, and that time 125 metres short, over.
Speed and height, we'll bang on then.
Roger that.
Tim managed to bring the B-17 in on track, but this time it is John's calculations that are wrong, and the bombs have dropped over 100 metres short. If they'd been flying at 15,000 feet, as crews did during the war, their bombs would have fallen 3 miles off target. These are the mistakes of a raw first-time crew. 60 years ago, a crew's first operation would always be their most dangerous.
I had a telegram, and it read, "Mum's had an accident, can you get home for an hour?" So off I went, saw my mother, came back. The place was pretty well deserted. Couldn't find the rest of my crew. I went into the mess, and there's a crew there to come back early. And I said, where's Dickie Bennett and the crew? They said, well, your crew's gone out on ops. So they can't have. They don't have a spare bod in a brand new crew. This well, they desperately needed everyone.
On their first operation, Adge's crew had set out with a replacement wireless operator.
I thought, well, I shall get my leg pulled when they get back, being a sprog. Everybody else is behind a trip. And the things then never came back. That was it. First trip went down. Oh boy, that's a fact. It hurt. Still does.
Adge's entire crew were killed on that first operation, including the man who replaced him at the last minute, Flight Sergeant P.W. Upton. Adge Bowl joined another crew and went on to fly a further 31 operations. Against all the odds, all 5 of the recruits' grandfathers survived the war, having flown a combined total of 163 operations. Now, their grandchildren come in for their 3rd and final bomb run.
Okay, guys, turning back on for the bombing run.
This is the crew's last chance to hit the target. So far, both their drops have been over 100 metres out.
Bomb doors, please. B-17 copy, you are clear to continue, make this the good one. Rack selectors on, bombs armed.
Okay, let's go for it, guys.
Left. Steady. Right. Steady. Bomb's gone! Okay, that looks good through the bomb sight. Excellent work, boys!
As the crew turn for home, Brendan O'Brien goes down to inspect the damage to the target.
That is extraordinary. You couldn't be more close than actually getting a direct hit. You've even got spatter on the wall. Absolutely amazing. That would have destroyed this place completely. Tremendous job. They've blown the place to pieces. That's, as far as I'm concerned, a direct hit. Outstanding. And well done, John. He got it right at last.
Mission accomplished. The crew returned to their base at Duxford for the final time. For all 5, the excitement of a successful training operation is tinged with thoughts of their grandfathers.
The adrenaline is incredible. It's as close as I'll ever be to being there, to doing it for real, and flicking the switches for the rack selectors and for the bomb doors, and talking to the skipper, talking to the flight engineer on the bomb run, and then the adrenaline really kicks in. But Let's remember that there were lots of guys that did this night after night after night. This would have been nothing special to them, but when they were up there, people were shooting at them. I hope that we've gone somewhere near honouring their memory. The crew have worked so well together, and the positions that we've all ended up in, I think we're all very suited to what we've actually done. And to bring a team together like that, with them all working, doing their own different skills, and actually have that work together with totally different things actually happening, I think is a really, really good achievement.
It's funny, you know, I always used to wonder why he never talked about his missions and why he never talked about what he'd been through. Now I can kind of understand, and it's not really, it's probably half of it's the horror of what they've seen, but the other half is that nobody will really understand quite what you're seeing up there, quite what you're feeling up there. It's just the whole experience that's overwhelming.
The crew have reached the end of a remarkable journey, coming closer than ever before to understanding what it was their grandfathers achieved 60 years ago. If they had flown during the war, they would have had to reach the magic number of 30 operations before they could be relieved from active duty.
We thought, well, we're never going to get through 30 trips. So we may as well assume, and this is the way I felt. I thought, well, the best thing to do is say, well, I'm already dead. And every day that I'm alive is a bonus.
After our last landing, the Padre came in with a chat, and they said, well, what does it feel like? Well, everybody's excited and drinking. I said, to me, it's reprieve. You just couldn't believe it was ever going to happen.
Nearly 56,000 men of Bomber Command never saw the end of the war. For all of those who have survived, the events of 60 years ago are impossible to forget.
I went in as a young, raw boy. I came out as a gnarled, old, cynical man in some ways. I wouldn't have missed the experience for anything, but I wouldn't want anyone else to go through it.
It's imprinted on my brain, and I'll never lose it. People I knew, and I couldn't begin to remember their names, and yet these memories are so vivid, and they'll be there till they put the lid on, I suppose.
Well, closer than brothers, that's the only way you can say. You lived and you breathed together, particularly when you were flying. You had to. And one thing I'm not been very proud of many things in my life, but I was proud to be one of those.
And that brings the series to an end. Read the survivors' own stories in the book Bomber Crew, available now for £20. To order, call 0870 1234 344 or just click onto channel4.com/shop. Up next, a quest for justice and a really bad football season takes centre stage in a double bill of Without a Trace.